Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to plow ahead with some more of the Chapter 11 notes. I don't have a ton to go over today. I just want to kind of go over a couple concepts that relate to the banking system and some interest groups that have had a lot of power there, as well as a couple different types of interest groups and how those have popped up over time and influenced other pieces of legislation. Now, before I start with that, I want to kind of review something from the last lecture that I saw a couple people mess up with the last writing prompt. So a public interest lobby is any type of group that benefits non-members. So an example would be the ACLU. They collect money from people who care about other people's civil liberties, and they use that money to defend people in court or to pay for lawsuits or things like that. The money goes not to the people who are paying, but to other people. So I had several people who called their interest groups public interest lobbies. For instance, some people who had unions, things like that. The whole purpose of a union is to get higher wages for the workers who work for that union, so that by nature is not a public interest lobby. They're out for themselves and not out for other people. So please make sure when you hear public interest lobby, it's any type of interest group that's trying to benefit other people, not necessarily just their members. Now, I do want to touch on a couple other things real quick about how interest groups work. Interest groups, most of the big ones today, have very large staffs. So let's say I am the NRA, the NAACP. They often have hundreds or sometimes thousands of people who work on their payroll. And oftentimes those staff really set the agenda for whatever that interest group happens to be. Now, some interest groups, like I mentioned before, are incredibly diverse. So the AARP, you have seniors who are liberal and conservative, who may be rural or urban. There's all sorts of things that those groups care about. So the direction the AARP takes, or any interest group, is the direction that their staff decide to take them. So oftentimes the staff play a significant role in determining what interest groups do. The book talks about a survey where there was a large union where we found out that a lot of members of that union didn't support something that union staff was really pushing. And the reason for that is that the staff themselves were the ones who make the decisions. And if members don't like it, they just cannot renew their membership in that interest group the next year. But the staff generally drive what interest groups do. And because of the fact that we oftentimes have really large staffs in some of these groups, you see that a lot. Now, one thing that interest groups really get involved with oftentimes are our social movements that we see in the United States. So I'm going to focus on environmental today just because there's a couple of really good examples of this. But oftentimes an interest group will pop up in response to some sort of event that is happening. So if we look at some environmental issues over time, we will see that. So I want to kind of walk through a couple of those real quick. So we have several different environmental interest groups, and those interest groups could all merge together into one, but oftentimes some of these groups are non-political. Other times other groups are very, very political, and there's a couple examples of that. So our first environmental interest group really popped up in the 1890s, and that was the Sierra Club. And the goal of the Sierra Club was simply conservation. So to try to conserve America's lands, to conserve some of our wildlife. They're the ones who, as we move through the early 1900s, are going to push for the creation of the national park system, and are really going to get land set aside, designated for wildlife preservation and conservation. So that group, again, not super political when you compare them to other environmental interest groups that may be out there. Now, when we move into the 1930s, environmental movements start to pop up again, and this really popped up during the New Deal. And a lot of things that the FDR did during the New Deal was to promote land conservation, building electricity, all sorts of things that involve the use of land. And we started to see some interest groups pop up because of that. That's when the National Wildlife Federation emerged. The Wilderness Society is another interest group I don't think anyone here has. But again, interest groups started to pop up because of government action. And that was really a significant time in our country's history where we were spending a lot of money on things that could potentially have an impact on the environment, and interest groups formed because of that. Now, in the 1960s, we start to get some more groups that were a little bit more extreme start to pop up. As America industrialized, we had a lot of businesses that were polluting. We started to see a lot of other interest groups start to pop up that were really, in some cases, violent, or in other cases, really spending a lot of money to lobby government to try to address some of these issues. So we have a group called the Environmental Defense Fund. It's a very liberal interest group that really tries to bring suits against government or against businesses for pollution or any sort of damage to the environment. Now, all of these interest groups care about the environment, but they all have different approaches. The Wildlife Federation is slightly different than the Sierra Club, and those two are very different from the Environmental Defense Fund. So this is why we have so many interest groups in the United States, is we have one topic, the environment, and on that topic we have a bunch of different interest groups that all have different spins on that topic. So that's part of the reason why we have so many interest groups in the United States today. Now, we see this as well when we look at the feminist movement. Really, we had 4 really large feminist movements in American history. Each one of those really brought about different organizations. Now, obviously, the first feminist movement that we talk about a lot is getting women the right to vote. And the League of Women Voters really was created to try to do that and to get women, once they got the right to vote and they could vote in the election of 1920, getting them educated, excuse me, getting them educated on how to vote, who to vote for, what candidates cared about women's issues, and things like that. Now, since then, since women have gotten the right to vote, the League of Women Voters has changed their tone. Now the League of Women Voters are oftentimes the people who are putting out general, nonpartisan information about candidates. They're not liberal, they're not conservative. They exist today to get people to be knowledgeable about elections, men and women, and they put a lot of information out. They have a lot of good information on their website about different candidates who are up for election, trying to get people to be knowledgeable. Now, today we have several other types of feminist movements that exist, and they all kind of have different approaches. Now, we have some of these interest groups that are really geared towards targeting issues that are important to all women. So we have an interest group, obviously the League of Women Voters, getting women registered to vote, excuse me, getting them to understand candidates. We have another interest group called the Federation of Business and Professional Women, trying to get women into the business world, trying to break the glass ceiling, get women promoted into different positions, things like that. They're really targeting all women, all parts of the country, all interests, things like that. Now, these interest groups tend to not be super political. They are groups that are trying to get information out, trying to promote women's empowerment, things like that, but they're not interest groups like you would see with the National Organization for Women, which this is an interest group that oftentimes takes very divisive stances on certain issues. They're obviously going to have a very strong stance on abortion. You're not going to see the League of Women Voters take a stand on abortion. That's not an issue that they're going to be talking about. Now, both of these interest groups are what we would call feminist interest groups, or part of the feminist movement. Excuse me. But they all have very different approaches, and they kind of go about what they do in different ways. Now, oftentimes groups like the National Organization for Women are national. They don't really take stances on local issues. The League of Women Voters are educating people about local issues. So you're going to see very different approaches at all levels of our federal system in terms of what those interest groups do. Now, the third type of interest group that we see today are interest groups that really are focused on having some benefit to women in various aspects of life. So let's say that you have women who feel that they've been discriminated against in some sense. We have interest groups that collect money, and these are generally public interest lobbies or public interest groups that will bring suits on behalf of people in various attributes. So again, it's obviously not voter education or things like that like you would see with the League of Women Voters, not super controversial stances on things like you would see with the National Organization for Women, but trying to take money from people who are interested in promoting women's rights in the United States and using that to bring suits on behalf of people who've been discriminated against, things like that. So That's kind of like the middle ground between those two, and that's kind of the role that the ACLU holds, it broadly, not just in terms of women's issues, but you see that within the feminist movement as well. You see this within in the environmental movement. You see this in a lot of the big movements that we see in the United States. So again, different types of interest groups, all on the same topic, and that's kind of the moral of the story here, is that we have all of these broad-based topics, and we have a 10, 15, 20 interest groups on each topic. So this is why we are having so many interest groups in the United States when you compare us to other countries. Now, I just want to talk very briefly about unions, because unions have changed fairly significantly throughout our country's history. The major unionization in the United States really happened in the 1930s after the Industrial Revolution in the United States, and it really started to grow during the Great Depression. And the whole purpose of unions is to get workers better wages, better working conditions, things like that. So at the height of unionization, it was more than a third of non-farm workers in the United States were union members in 1945. So the unions and through their political action committees held a ton of power. So whether we're looking at the United Auto Workers or the teachers unions or whatever the case may be, had a ton of power. Now, the percentage of workers today that are members of unions is only 12%. And the vast majority of those today are in the public sector and not the private sector. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. Obviously, we have not seen a decline in union membership in the public sector with teachers and police officers and firefighters, where we have in the private sector. A lot of automobile plants have moved from northern states that were very pro-union down to southern states which are very anti-union. You've also seen some of those automobile plants move out of the United States. So when they move out of the United States, then obviously those union jobs leave. Now, there's obviously benefits to unions, higher wages, better working conditions, things like that. There's also a negative connotation to some people that come from unions. So it is not uncommon for people to believe that unions protect lazy workers, is that it's really hard to get fired if you're a member of a union. And I would say there's some truth to that. I wouldn't say that's necessarily exactly the case, but it is definitely harder to get fired from a job if you're a member of a union than if you're not. You have certain rights that you have in certain positions. So unionization in the United States has declined. The big thing I want you to pay attention to is that it is still high in the public sector. And you see in the second bullet here that 36% of public sector employees today, and this is police officers, firefighters, teachers, things like that, are union members. Compare that to the private sector, and it's just under 7%. So unionization still strong in the public sector, not as strong in the private sector. And what that has led to is that our private sector unions like the UAW have significantly less power today than they had back in the 1950s and 60s, when they had a lot more pull there. Now, in 2011, we had a big case out of Wisconsin where the governor of Wisconsin at the time, a guy by the name of Scott Walker, tried to restrict the collective bargaining rights of unions. And basically what that means is today I don't negotiate my salary with Northmont. The Northmont union negotiates all teacher salaries for people who have a certain amount of experience or things like that. Well, in 2011, Scott Walker in Wisconsin basically said, what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate the rights of unions to do that. And he got recalled because of that. So if you recall from back in the early chapters, a recall is when voters put somebody up on the ballot to basically remove them from office because of one of their actions. Now, he ended up surviving that recall, but that legislation was incredibly controversial in Wisconsin. And it wasn't necessarily controversial from the perspective of teachers, but it was really controversial from the perspective of law enforcement. Police officers not being able to do this, firefighters not being able to do this. So this was something that was significant. Now in Ohio, they tried to do the same thing. We had something called Senate Bill 5 that was passed back in 2014. Voters actually put a referendum on the ballot and removed that piece of legislation. So again, the general, even though we've seen unionization in the United States decline, the general public view of unions is still fairly strong, and that's the reason why Scott Walker got recalled. It's the reason why Senate Bill 5 in Ohio got removed. So unions still have some power today. Now, The largest public unions in 2009 gave about $2 million to candidates through their political action committees. That seems like a lot of money, but when you compare that to the Chamber of Commerce that we looked at the other day, they gave $137 million. So you can see the big difference between unions versus some of these other groups in terms of their power. Now, obviously, unions have one big benefit compared to other interest groups is that they can reliably raise money. If you want to be a member of that union, a portion of your money goes to lobbying members of Congress. Other portions of your money that is voluntary would go to political action committees and things like that. Other interest groups are forced to raise money from other ways. You either have to pay to join that group, they get some sort of grants or sort of mail solicitation that they get from people, things like that. So unions do have one significant benefit when you compare them to other types of interest groups, in that they have a lot of money on hand, and that's something that they tend to have pretty good handle on. Now, last thing I want to talk about today is this idea of an upper class bias when it comes to interest groups. Now, we kind of see this no matter what topic we're talking about, whether it's environmental, whether it's women's rights, whether it's business, whatever the case may be, is that if you want to join an interest group, oftentimes you have to pay dues in order to do that. You have to pay some sort of cost. So the people who can afford to do that tend to have a little bit more money than people who don't join. So if you look at the NRA and who NRA members are, if you have to pay a due, if I'm a gun owner who has some money, I might be willing to pay for that membership. If I'm a gun owner who's lower income, I might want to benefit from what the NRA does, but I may not join because I may not have the money to be able to do so. Now, once you get a bunch of members who tend to be people who have a little bit more income, those interest groups tend to act in the interest of some of those people, sometimes more than others who are non-members. And that kind of gets at that free rider problem that we talked about at the beginning of this chapter. So there's this kind of idea that unions sort of have this upper class bias. Now, to give you a great example of that, and the power that some unions have, I want to kind of end today by talking about what happened with our banks. Now, back in 1933, in this very last bullet on this slide, it talks about, in 1933, something known as the Glass-Steagall Act, and that is a piece of legislation that you do need to know about. So Glass-Steagall Act basically put in place a lot of restrictions on banks. So when we got to the Great Depression, if you remember from U.S. history, we had a lot of bank runs. People were going to the bank trying to get their money because of the Depression, and the banks didn't have any money. So what had happened before is that the banks, when you put money in the bank loans that money out to somebody else. They don't just stick it in a vault somewhere. And what happened in the Great Depression is that they loaned out pretty much everybody's money. So when people came to get their money out of the banks had no money to give them. So in 1933, in response to that, Congress passed what was known as the Glass-Steagall Act. And the Glass-Steagall Act put restrictions on banks in terms of how much money they could lend out. They have to keep a certain amount of money in reserve. It also created what we called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If you ever go to the bank, there's a sign that sits up there right next to the teller. It says that your money is FDIC insured. And basically what that means is that if that bank closes and runs off with your money, the federal government will basically provide insurance on your money. So anything up to $250,000, the federal government will give you that money if your bank runs off with it. So you are safe. It's the same way that you would have health insurance or car insurance. You have bank insurance, essentially. So if your bank is fraudulent, then there's some sort of kind of protection that you have from that. So that was what went into place in the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, what happened over the course of the next 60 years is that lobbyists representing the banks slowly started to pick away at some of this restrictions that we had put on banks. And we made it easier and easier and easier for banks to begin kind of taking advantage of consumers, giving money to people, giving loans to people who they know can't pay it back. So I'll give you an example. When we get to the early 2000s, if I, as a teacher, were to go into a bank and say, I want to take out a loan to buy a $600,000 house, well, they're going to look at my salary and say, well, there's really no way this guy's going to be able to pay this back, but we'll give him the loan anyway, because if I can't pay that loan back, then the bank, they get the house, so they get something out of it. The only person who's really screwed is me. And because there was no real federal protection against that, the banks could really do whatever they wanted to, and they kept making all of these really bad loans to people that were basically risky mortgages. And because we had repealed a lot of the portions of the Glass-Steagall Act because of the power of interest groups, they were able to get away with that. Now, in 2010, after the financial collapse, and this was because we took away all of these restrictions, banks started taking advantage of people. And in 2008, we had the housing bubble. And what happened in 2008 is all of these people had mortgages out on their homes that they couldn't pay back because they had been loaned more money than they could possibly pay back. And we basically had a lot of people lose their houses. So Congress decides to pass a replacement bill, and we called that the Dodd-Frank Act. And that you need to know. You need to know that as well. That's the second bullet here. The Dodd-Frank Act tried to put some of those restrictions back in place, but when Congress went to write that, they kept getting lobbied by all of these interest groups that represented the banks. And at the end of the day, the vast majority of the Dodd-Frank Act, which regulates banks, was written by the banks. The interest groups representing these banks, in part, wrote this bill. So basically, they're being regulated today a little bit more than they were 10, 12 years ago, but not nearly as much as they were back in the 1930s when interest groups had significantly less power than they have today. So because Congress listened to this interest group, they were really able to do what they wanted to and really control the industry much more than I think anybody thought they would be able to do. So the banks today have a ton of power, and the reason why they have that power is they have money and they have resources and they have the ear of Congress. They're able to get things done there. Okay, so I'm going to stop there today with the notes. What I would like you to do for your writing prompt today is I want you to kind of go back, and we're going to do a little bit of review. And I saw this with the multiple choice questions that you did on the assignment for yesterday. A lot of you did really well on that. Generally, if you were scoring 17 out of 21 or better, and I put your score in progress book so you could see that, I put it as a comment, you're in really good shape in that unit. We had a lot of people who had some lower scores there. If you scored down anywhere between 9 and 15 points, you definitely want to kind of go over some of the things in that first unit again. If you're scoring 18 to 21, you're in really, really good shape. Now, for today's writing prompt, I want to revisit a couple of the cases that it mentioned there. So I would like you to briefly summarize for me the McCulloch versus Maryland case and the U.S. v. Lopez case, and talk about how the rulings in those two cases differed in terms of the views of the national government versus the state government in terms of who has power. So McCulloch versus Maryland, U.S. versus Lopez, what did those cases do? How did they kind of present a different view of the role of government, national versus state, and who has power? Hope you all have a good weekend. Please make sure you get that on there before midnight tonight, and I will talk to you on Monday. Have a good day.